All right, so the United States is currently hosting the Summit of the Americas, which in their words is supposed to be this sort of coalition building promotion of human rights and freedom of the press and democracy. But so far, for a lot of different reasons that we're going to get into in this video, it has been pretty much a complete unmitigated disaster. But first, I want to show you a clip here from Abby Martin, who is an absolutely fantastic journalist who does great reporting on U.S. imperialism. And in this clip, we're going to see her confronting Secretary of State Anthony Blinken on the rampant hypocrisy of the United States government when it comes to issues like democracy and freedom of the press. So let's go ahead and watch this clip.
Secretary Blinken, what about Shireen Abu Akleh? She was murdered by Israeli forces. Right? CNN just agreed to this. These are your two greatest allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Israel. They have murdered American journalists and there have been absolutely no repercussions. And you're sitting up here talking about the freedom of press and democracy. The United States is denying sovereignty to tens of millions of people around the world with draconian sanctions for electing leaders that you do not like. Why is there no accountability for Israel or Saudi Arabia for murdering journalists? It is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist in Palestine.
I deplore the loss of Shireen. She was a remarkable journalist, an American citizen, as you all know. And there too, we are determined to follow the facts and get to the truth of what happened.
Secretary Blinken, with all due respect.
I'm sorry, with respect, they have not yet been established.
Yes,
we're
it has.
No, they have not. We are looking for an independent, credible investigation. When that investigation happens, we will follow the facts wherever they lead. It's as straightforward as that. That has not yet happened, but it's something that we very much want to see happen.
And we'll have time after the panel, of course, to talk more about this.
Okay, so listen, first off, obviously, credit to Abby Martin for doing the job that journalists are supposed to be doing and holding the most powerful people and institutions and governments accountable for their actions, and in this case, for their rampant hypocrisy. But, you know, while it is commendable that she's going out there and putting this pressure on Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, this should not be out of the ordinary, right? This shouldn't be on somebody like Abby Martin to be asking these types of questions. This should just be the baseline for anybody who wants to pretend to call themselves a journalist. But on top of that, with his response there in terms of Shireen Abu Akleh, right, he's saying the evidence is not in, right? We don't know. There's no way to know conclusively who killed Shireen Abu Akleh or what their motivations were in this case. So, you know, we just have to sit back and wait for some independent investigation to verify this. Now, there's multiple problems with that. Number one, as Abby Martin was pointing out in this clip, this has already been confirmed, okay? Even CNN, a normally right-wing and in many cases reactionary outlet, especially when it comes to issues surrounding Israel and Palestine, even they have put together a conclusive report here saying that not only did Israeli forces kill Shireen, but on top of that, it looks like it was a targeted attack, meaning an assassination. Okay, so really, if I wanted to be overly generous and charitable in my interpretation of what Anthony Blinken is saying in this clip, maybe you could make a stretch of an argument and say that it's up in the air or up for debate as to whether or not these Israeli security forces intentionally knew that it was Shireen Abu Akleh and went to assassinate her on purpose, knowing that she is this world-renowned, incredible Palestinian journalist. That's really the only thing that you could even make barely a stretch of an argument to say that that is still up in the air. But it is certainly 100% not up in the air that it was Israeli security forces who were responsible for killing her. So the fact that he can't even admit that, the fact that he can't even say, yes, it was Israel responsible for this, and so regardless of what, you know, independent investigation or so-called independent investigation were to find, it's going to be holding these soldiers responsible for the murder, okay? All of the evidence that we have in terms of on-the-ground eyewitness testimony, all of the evidence that we have from B'Tselem as well as CNN's report in terms of where the Israeli security forces were placed during this. They were the only group of people that had even a remotely closely line of fire that could have killed Shireen. So again, all of the evidence is indicating this is a very clear picture of what we have on our hands here. This was Israeli security forces assassinating a Palestinian journalist. And so, you know, she's asking the right questions here, but again, he turns around and just says, oh, we need a new independent investigation, as if that is something that he is seriously proposing, okay? To give you a perspective in terms of how laughable this suggestion actually is, okay? Here from The Intercept, this is all the way back from May of 19th, so pretty much immediately after the killing happened. They say, Israeli investigation into killing a Palestinian American journalist ends before it begins. Israel won't investigate soldiers who fired in the direction of Shireen Abu Akleh, even though new evidence undermines their account of what happened. So again, we know for a fact that they initially lied about this and basically tried to blame Palestinian resistance fighters for the killing of this journalist. So they're already proven themselves to be not credible, not that they deserved any inch of credibility before this killing, but they've proven themselves in this specific instance to not be reliable actors. And on top of this, they say Harel also reported that there were no plans for a real criminal investigation of the Israeli soldiers because, quote, such an investigation, which would necessitate questioning as potential criminal suspects soldiers for their actions during a military operation, would provoke opposition and controversy within the IDF and in Israeli society in general. So in other words, Israel, their officials, are openly admitting that they have absolutely no interest whatsoever in participating in an investigation that even treats their own security forces as suspects in that investigation. So does that seem to you like it's going to be a situation in which Israel or the United States is going to be participatory in an actual, real, independent investigation that produces the results that verify that, yes, they were responsible for this? No, of course they're not willing to do that. So at the end of the day, Anthony Blinken's response on the specific nature of this killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, all he's doing is trying to deflect. He's trying to obfuscate. He's trying to basically drag this out as long as possible until he believes that the media is going to inevitably forget about it, basically. That's his goal here. He has no actual interest whatsoever in getting to the root of the problem here. In this case, it is the continued ongoing apartheid and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. So, he has absolutely no substantive response to that, and clearly it's a perfect example to draw a distinction in terms of, or more so a hypocritical approach from the United States. It's a perfect example to point that out because you can get up there and you can preach about democracy and human rights and freedom of the speech, but then if you're not inviting these other countries, which is another component of this that we should get to, if you're not inviting these other countries like Venezuela or Cuba along issues of human rights and democracy and freedom of the speech, while you're simultaneously defending the state of Israel, which is an apartheid state, and again, continuing in an ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people, what are people supposed to take from that? I mean, clearly, you don't have any principled stance in favor of democracy or human rights or freedom of the press. Okay, you have absolutely no interest in that whatsoever. You're just picking and choosing which countries you want to hold accountable for arbitrary standards of human rights and democracy, while completely ignoring your own goddamn allies who are much more egregiously violating those standards that you yourself are putting in place at the beginning of this. So, on top of the Israeli issue, before we get to this, also we have Biden going to meet with Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, apparently this month or next month. So again, you want to talk about human rights abuses, you're looking at the guy who is probably the worst on the global stage in terms of human rights abuses right here, okay? Not somebody who believes in democracy, not somebody who believes in freedom of the press, obviously, as he is responsible for the murder and dismemberment of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So clearly, again, you see the blatant hypocrisy here, but really the hypocrisy goes so deep that I'm not even going to be able to get to all of the different angles that you could point to. But first, to start us off here, again, from a great breakdown from Common Dreams, Kenny Stansel, on how much of an absolute joke this summit of the Americas really was from the beginning. They say Mexican president boycotts summit over U.S. exclusion of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Okay, so not only do you not have these other countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, you also had the Honduran president who decided to do the same thing as the Mexican president in this, but you have all of these different massively influential, important countries within the Americas that are not going to this summit either because the United States didn't invite them to it or because they're abstaining from it because they see how completely ridiculous it is to bar these countries from going to this so-called summit of democracy and human rights and freedom of the speech, freedom of the press, while you're simultaneously supporting your allies overseas who are much bigger violators of those same standards. But a little bit of details here. They say Mexico's leftist president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, announced Monday that he is skipping the Summit of the Americas, following through on his threat to boycott the upcoming meeting if the White House refused to invite officials from all nations in the Western Hemisphere, and the Biden administration's decision to bar the governments of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela from this week's gathering in Los Angeles was made final on Sunday. And they say unnamed sources familiar with deliberations between Washington officials and their Latin American and Caribbean counterparts, including those in Mexico Mexico said that President Joe Biden's long-anticipated move was based on concerns about the lack of democracy and respect for human rights in these three countries, okay? So lack of democracy and respect for human rights in these three countries while you're about to go take a trip to meet with Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman, one of the worst human rights violators in the entire world, to basically get on your hands and knees and beg him to release more oil into the global market. But they continue saying, however, the White House is reportedly considering a role for Juan Guaido, an unelected and unpopular right-wing opposition figure who participated in a failed Trump-backed bid to overthrow elected Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in 2019 at a virtual side event. Okay, so understand this, all right? This is the Summit of the Americas, all right? So-called promotion of freedom and democracy, all right? This is the promotion of democracy, and you are inviting a guy who is not the president of Venezuela, and you're barring the actual president and leadership of the country of Venezuela, okay? How much of a fucking joke is this? It's completely fucking ridiculous. Juan Guaido, regardless of your, semi-valid criticisms of Venezuela, and there are plenty that you could levy at that country, but regardless of your views on Nicolas Maduro on a personal level or your views of potential human rights abuses, Juan Guaido is not the fucking president. I mean, literally, he's just not the president. So it is completely laughable that you would pretend to be standing for democracy while you're inviting an unelected coup leader to this event, okay? While barring the actual elected president of Venezuela. I mean, completely fucking ridiculous at surface level. But they continue here saying, Washington does not officially recognize Maduro as the legitimate leader of the South American country, even though he was reelected last year in a contest that U.S. legal observers called fair, and instead, the U.S. recognizes Guaido as the interim president, and Biden previously invited the Venezuelan coup leader to his administration's so-called Summit for Democracy in December. And in addition to Maduro, the U.S. is excluding Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega, whose 2021 re-election Biden called fraudulent, from the Summit of the Americas. And according to U.S. officials, the Biden administration decided against inviting lower-ranking government representative to attend in place of Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel, who said last month that he would not travel to Los Angeles even if invited, due to the White House's brutal pressure campaign to make this week's event non-inclusive. And on top of, the brazen idiocy of not inviting the leadership of these countries. On top of that, you also have these added layers of actual human rights abuses and violations of international law that the U.S. is responsible for in Latin America, in a lot of these countries, right? I mean, you're simultaneously saying that Cuba is too much of a human rights violator to invite to this summit, while simultaneously the United States has been imposing a 60-year-long embargo on this country. Biden, on top of the Trump sanctions on Cuba, in a complete reversal of the Obama approach to Cuba, Trump levied 200 different sanctions on Cuba, restricting the flow of supplies in and out of the country, and then Biden takes office and doubles down on that failed approach of isolationism in regards to Cuba. So you are preventing much needed materials and much needed resources from getting in and out of this country. You are responsible for civilian casualties in many of these countries around the world that the United States is levying these brutal sanctions against. Okay, so you want to talk about human rights abuses, look at yourself in the mirror. I mean, goddamn, on top of that, not just the sanctions that we're levying at a lot of these countries, but I mean, we invited Colombian representatives, okay? Colombia, a country that is widely known for being extreme violators of human rights. So just to give you a perspective on this, from Amnesty International, they say, Colombia 2021, 8 children were killed by security forces targeting the armed groups, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, and the National Liberation Army, the ELN, in Choco, Guayavare, sorry if I'm completely butchering that name, and Chaqueta departments. Killings of former FARC combatants increased, and at least 100,000 people were forcibly displaced or confined as a result of the ongoing conflict, particularly affecting the rights of indigenous peoples and those of Afro descendants. And in the context of the national strike, there were numerous reports of excessive use of force by security forces against peaceful protesters, particularly in Cali, and police arbitrarily detained and tortured protesters, and there were reports of sexual and gender-based violence against women and LGBTQ people, and at least 100 people sustained eye trauma due to the unlawful and excessive use of lethal weapons by members of the Mobile Anti-Riot Squad. It sounds a lot like what we saw here in the United States in 2020. And they say killings and threats against human rights defenders reached alarming levels. So you're barring Cuba, you're barring Venezuela, you're barring, all of these other various countries along human rights abuse lines, while simultaneously inviting Colombia, which is much more responsible for human rights abuses within their own country than a lot of those other ones that you were barring from attending this summit. So Let's just think about this for a second. What is the key difference here between Colombia and Bolivia, per se, or between Colombia and Cuba in this sense, or Colombia and any of the other ones that they have banned from attending this summit? The difference is Colombia has historically been a right-wing reactionary government backed by the United States, the CIA, the State Department, who has been subservient in large ways to multinational U.S. Corporations and the interests of the capitalist class here in the United States. So that's the key difference. Same as it's the key difference with Israel and Saudi Arabia. Why do you think that the Biden administration is somehow magically able to overlook the human rights abuses and war crimes of a country like Saudi Arabia led by Mohammed bin Salman? Well, it's because, again, he's going there to get on his hands and knees and beg them to release more oil into the global market. That's it. It's just about resource control, okay, as it has been throughout all of human history, or at least all throughout the recent history of the United States especially. I mean, this is what it's always come down to. And not only that, but I mean, where do you think these police in Colombia are getting a lot of their equipment and a lot of their information on training? It's coming directly from the United States. I mean, surprise, surprise, right? Again, the overlap here is not just in the police tactics, it's also in the police weapons that they are using against these peaceful protesters, as they did here in the United States as well. So again, nothing surprising here, but just another pure example of rampant hypocrisy by inviting this country of Colombia, that is widely known for being one of the biggest violators in Latin America on human rights abuses, and you're inviting them while simultaneously using that as an excuse to bar all of these other countries. It just so happens that the countries that you're barring are ones that happen to be left-wing governments, ones that happen to be not subservient to the interests of U.S. multinational corporations. I wonder if there's a correlation there. I mean, it's wild out here, but they continue. Okay, here we got an article from The Guardian. So again, think about the context of them here promoting democracy, right? Silence reigns on the U.S.-backed coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia. The Organization of American States, which was one of the main organizations that was at this Summit of the Americas preaching about democracy, they say the OAS had a key role in the destruction of the country's democracy last November. So the same organization, the OAS, along with the United States State Department, going and preaching about democracy after you guys just tried to do a coup in Bolivia that was temporarily successful. Thankfully, Evo Morales' party came back by storm and ended up winning the next round of elections and booted out their fascist leadership. But, no thanks to the United States, they were actively promoting a fascist leader to coup this country, okay, to take them over, because they didn't like the fact that Evo Morales' party was less subservient to the interest of the capitalist class here in the United States. So again, you want to preach about democracy, you want to preach about human rights. I mean, look at what you guys are doing. Look at what your own organizations are doing. So it's just, completely laughable. On top of all of this, we still have the prosecution of Julian Assange, right? I mean, brazenly hypocritical for the United States and its representatives, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, to go out there and preach about human rights, freedom of the press, democracy, while every single piece of evidence that we can look to in modern history and to the current day right now indicates that the United States has never and does not right now under the Biden administration care about human rights abuses. They pick and choose which countries they want to criticize, which leaders they want to condemn, purely along the lines of who is going to be our little bitch, okay? That's really what it comes down to. Who's going to be a bitch for the State Department, the CIA, the U.S. multinational corporations? If you aren't willing to do their bidding, then guess what? We're going to call you dictators. We are going to try to coup you. We are going to try to install fascist leaders in your place, all while preaching about democracy and freedom of the press and human rights abuses. It's just a complete goddamn farce.